Okay, let's rank PJ Harvey's albums. Ahoy hoy everybody, and welcome to this album ranking. So as promised, it's PJ Harvey. Okay, PJ Harvey, Polly Harvey, I've been a fan of since about 94, 95. I'd been reading about her in Enemy and Melody Maker and Vox and various other magazines at the time. Was in HMV in Cardiff where I was studying, and they had the 4-track demos album, so I thought, I'll give it a go. Picked it up on cassette, absolutely loved it. Went back and got the earlier albums and have bought everything ever since. She's... Spoilers for those of you who haven't watched my favourite female solo artist video, but she is my joint favourite female solo artist. It's her, Alicia Keys and Kate Nash, and depending on who I've been listening to most at the time is which one of those three becomes top. It's a bit difficult at the moment because I've obviously been listening to all of Polly's albums, but I did go and see Alicia Keys live last week, so they're sort of both up there still at the moment. But yes, as those of you who follow me on Instagram will know, over the last couple of weeks I have been listening to all of Polly's albums in sequence. I am including all her normal studio albums, plus the 2 albums she did with John Parrish. None of the demo albums, not even 4-track demos, which received a separate release at the time. Also, not the Peel Sessions album, nor the All About Eve soundtrack. But all the normal studio albums, including the 2 with John Parrish, are included. The way I decided to do this was, as I was listening to each album, I was just jotting down a score out of 10 for each track as I listened, and then working out percentages. And that's quite interesting actually, because it's not quite given me the result I expected. I thought about then slightly changing it to match what was in my head, but no, I'm sticking with what's come out from the scores because it is interesting. But I will explain the discrepancies as I get to them, and then I've just jotted down a few notes for each album. So without any more waffle, let's crack on. So there's 11 albums, and my least favourite is A Woman and Man Walked By. The second of her albums with John Parrish. So the way these albums worked were that John did the music and then Polly wrote the lyrics. It's a perfectly good album. It just lacks any real standout tracks. There's nothing wrong with it. I mean, it's got 88% and it's my least favourite of these albums. So that says how much I love her work and how strong I feel these albums are. But yeah, it just... there was no real standout tracks. Did any get 10 out of 10? No, none of the tracks got 10 out of 10. They're all 8s and 9s. It's just not as good as everything else, basically. And then number 10 is Dancehall at Louse Point, the first of their 2 albums together. So if you feel that these albums shouldn't be included in this list, then fair enough. They're the bottom 2 anyway, so you can just worry about the next 9. A better album, does have some standout tracks. There's quite a few actually that I jotted down that I particularly liked. That was My Veil, Civil War, can't read my own writing, Civil War Correspondent, Taught, Un Cercle du Soleil, and Is That All There Is? It was sort of let down a little bit by a couple of throwaway tracks and a plethora of less memorable songs. The opening track, Girl, is pretty much just an instrumental with Polly doing some wordless vocalising over the top, so that can't score highly, you know. So yeah, that sort of diminished the album somewhat. It could have been a lot higher without those few weaker tracks. So of her solo, and I know, so Dry and Rid of Me, her first two albums, PJ Harvey was the band. It was a three-piece, and then from then on they are technically solo albums, but I'm using the solo album phrase as a catch-all. So my least favourite of those, so number 9 in the list, is White Chalk. So for this album, Polly was learning the piano, and she wrote the album on piano and plays piano throughout. The problem is where she's not a particularly good pianist at this stage. I think she has improved since. There's quite a bit of piano on the All About Eve soundtrack. Because she wasn't a particularly accomplished pianist, it sort of limited the songwriting, so it's all a bit samey. I think was my biggest problem with this. Yes, all the songs, literally all the songs, got 9 out of 10, so it's a 90%. So it's got the same mark as Dancehall at Louse Point. It's a really very very equal 9 really. I've put this one just above. It's nothing, you know, wrong with it, but there's no 10 out of 10 great tracks to boost it. And as I say, it's all a bit samey. Number 8, we have Is This Desire. This is sort of Polly's dance album. It's very reminiscent of quite a lot of the album, a sort of trip hop and what's the word I used? Trance. Of the late 90s. But it's all played with real instruments, you know, real drums and what have you. But yeah, it's definitely what I would consider her dance album. Lots of strong songs, but fewer standouts than the albums above it. Does suffer, as most of her albums do, with a strong start and a weaker ending to the album. The second side of most of her albums aren't as good as the first side. They're definitely front loaded. That's obviously just the way she likes to arrange them. Possibly, you know, the more experimental stuff goes on the later tracks. But yeah, a strong album. As I say, it's her dance album. I enjoy it a lot. But I prefer 7 more than it. Number 5, sorry, is her debut, Dry. So yes, for this, PJ Harvey, it was a trio with, why did I start this sentence? Stephen Vaughan, Rob Ellis. I remembered Rob, I couldn't remember Stephen's name. I'm surprised actually that this ended up quite as low as it did, because it is an album I absolutely love. It's a really strong start to her career. The first side is excellent. It's the second side, it lets it down slightly. There's 3 slightly lesser songs. They're sort of they show that they're still early in her songwriting career. There's sort of certain naivety and simplicity to them that lets them down a bit. I like the production on this album. It's nothing flashy. It just lets the songs do the talking. Out of the 11 tracks on there, there's 7 10 out of 10s, and yet it's still only my 7th favourite. Well, no, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, 7th favourite PJ Harvey album. But yeah, really strong debut, Dry. At number 6, and this is one that, I've bought all these albums for a reissue campaign and therefore re-listened to them all after a lot of them not having heard since they came out. And this, even having heard this just a few months ago when it was reissued, on listening to it a few days ago, I was a lot more impressed than I remember being. It's almost sort of a stylistic greatest hits. The first side of this is perfect. They were all 10 out of 10 songs. Second side less so. Again, it's let down by a couple of shorter tracks that don't really work as a complete song and therefore had to be marked down because of that. Yeah, sort of a mixture of earlier punkier stuff. I'm not using punk as in, Sex Pistols, but just, raw guitar-based, quite heavy tracks. And her later, there's a bit of it, Is It Desiree, dancey type stuff, bit of To Bring You My Love, swampy bluesy type stuff on there as well. It's a nice mixture, works really well. Yeah, it's one that sort of surprised me how much I enjoyed it. And so it ended up my 6th favourite. Number 5 is her to date most recent album, the Hope 6 Demolition Project. So like its predecessor, Let England Shake, this benefits from having a theme to the songwriting. And so there's a cohesiveness to the album. Unfortunately, when you compare it to Let England Shake, it is let down slightly by the fact it is quite similar to Let England Shake. Most of her albums are considerably different from their predecessors, but in this case, not so much. However, whereas on Let England Shake, the dulcimer features predominantly. That was her new instrument she'd learnt. On this, it's a saxophone. So there's lots of saxophone on here, which she's pretty good at. There's some good saxophone work on here. It's let down slightly by fewer standout tracks, but there's 4 or 5 really strong tracks on here, and the rest of them are all really good. Just not as good as the ones after it. Number 4 is her first Mercury Music Award, Mercury Prize winner. Stories from a City, Stories from a Sea. So an album that was half written at her home in Devon, those are the Stories from a Sea, and half written in New York, the Stories from a City. There's some really strong songs on here. The singles, Good Fortune, Place Called Home, This Is Love, are fantastic. What did I say about this in my notes? Yeah, that's about all I said, really. It is really, really good. Last couple of tracks on each side, actually, on this one, slightly less good than the rest, but, we're talking marginal here. It's... it is a fantastic album. However, it is all very polished. It was an album where she was trying to get some mainstream success, which worked. However, it's not really what I want from a PJ Harvey album. I like the rawer sound, the more experimental sound. So, I think that's slightly... Apart from, I tried to treat it fairly with the quality of the songs, but there is a few songs that possibly could have scored a little bit more if they were done in slightly different production style. But yeah, it's my 4th favourite PJ Harvey album. It is fantastic, and it was fully deserving of a Mercury Prize. And number 3, which scored exactly the same, but I do prefer it as an album, was our second Mercury Prize winner, the aforementioned Let England Shake. So yeah, this is a fantastic album. Songs about war, basically. What I love about this, as I mentioned previously, she's learnt the dulcimer for this, and lots of tracks feature it, and I think a lot of the tracks were even possibly written on it, and it adds a new side to her music. She sticks in a few tracks some samples that she sort of then bases the song loosely on, and it's something a bit different for her work. Was interesting, but above all, lyrically it's fascinating, but musically it was just a load of great songs. What else did I say? Diverse mix of songs, cohesive. Yeah, it's sort of after a couple of albums prior to this that weren't quite up there, the cohesive theme to the album has just gave her a new lease of life, gave her something to work towards, I think, and really boosted it into a fantastic album. So my number 2 is what I was expecting to be my number 1, and it's To Bring You My Love. Oops, hit myself in the face. I love this album. It's predominantly sort of swampy blues style to it. If you're familiar with Down by the Water, that's, very good indicator of the overall theme to the album. It's sort of a move away from the more grungy with a small G sound of her first 2 albums. It's more polished, but not excessively so. As I say, it's got this deep South American vibe. It's hard to fault the album. It really, what was it? 7 out of 10 tracks scored a 10 out of 10, and the other 3 scored 9. I think the only reason it ended up in second place is because it only had the 10 tracks on it. So the percentage worked slightly lower than the number 1, which had 14 tracks, I think. So I had more chance to get a slightly higher percentage. But yeah, I just absolutely adore this album. Highly tempted to, as I say, sort of cheat and stick it up to number 1. But decided I'd stick with the percentage marks. So my number 2 is To Bring You My Love. So my number 1 is Rid of Me. So yeah, it's 14 tracks, I think. So this was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Yeah, 14 tracks, of which, to be fair, only 2 weren't 10 out of 10. So it scored 97.9. I'm sure if I did a proper review on these albums, these scores would probably be slightly lower, but these were just gut instinct as I listened to them, what I marked for songs. So this was her second album, the second as a 3-piece band. Probably the album that sort of broke her as an artist to be paid attention to. 50 Foot Queenie and Man Size were both, I was going to say hits. They weren't in the sort of, they might have just crept into the top 40, but certainly in the indie charts and on radio, they got a lot of airplay. My only real problem with this album is the production by Steve Albini. It sounds better on vinyl than it did on the original CD, is the first thing I'll say. It's a couple of the tracks, the title track, the cover of Highway 61 Revisited, which is completely unnecessary, shouldn't be on there, especially when there's a track like M-Bike, which was on the 4-track demos that she could have put on there. Yeah, a couple of, those 2 tracks particularly, he does his quite typical, he produced Nevermind for Nirvana, and he does the sort of the loud, quiet bit, but it's sort of too extreme, and it's so quiet at the start, and then it sort of builds up, and it's sort of, I'm so busy sort of straining to hear at the start that it diminishes my enjoyment of the track. My other problem with it really is that I just do prefer the demo versions of these songs. They are what I knew first, to be fair. But I think, the production of the demos, such as it is, I prefer to Steve Albini's production of this album overall. But songwriting-wise, as I say, Highway 61 got the lowest, got 8, because it's unnecessary, doesn't need to be on there. And then, what was the other one that only got 9? Two after that. Oh, Yuri G. Again, I think that's just because I so much prefer the demo version. I love the demo version of it, but it doesn't quite work on the album. I mean, 9 out of 10. We're talking a small margin of problem, if you like. But yeah, overall, fantastic album, and my favourite, Rid of Me. So there we have it. Hope you found that interesting. I enjoyed revisiting those albums, even though, as I say, over the last 18 months of a reissue campaign, I have revisited all those albums. It's nice just listening through them for the best part of a fortnight and reminding myself why I love her music. Yeah, as I say, hope you found that interesting. Thank you for watching. Like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you in another video. Thanks.